You're listening to CITR News Live, bringing you live interviews with local activists, politicians, and policy experts from Vancouver and the Lower Mainland. I'm Arman Rana.
And I'm Isa Yu. It is Saturday, September 25th at 11:33 a.m. As you can see, we are not in the studio, but broadcasting from our various quarantine locations. So this past Wednesday at exactly 6:37, I panic texted Armand on Facebook and I said, and I quote in all caps, shit, BC is having an election, end quote.
Yeah, so it's true. I think our provincial government felt we weren't making enough difficult decisions right now, so they called us an election. So we're going to be interviewing a bunch of local MLA candidates in Vancouver. For today, we have an interview with NDP candidate Tesicca Truong.
Tesicca is a community organizer who co-founded City Hive Vancouver, an organization that promotes youth engagement in civic affairs. She also has an honors degree from SFU in environmental science. Tesicca Truong is running against incumbent Liberal MLA Michael Lee in the Vancouver-Langara riding.
Thanks so much for taking the time out of your undoubtedly busy schedule for meeting with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Yeah, so to start us off, as we all know, there's a pandemic going on. So what made you wake up one morning and think, sounds like a good time to run for office?
I think that running for office is really about an act of service and giving back to the community. And when I saw that there was an election that was happening, I knew that I had to put my name forward and to hopefully support John Horgan and the BC NDP in order to continue the good work that they've been doing over the past 3 years. You know, I grew up under the Liberal government, the BC Liberal government, and I remember just wondering, like, what were they up to? Like, what were they doing? Because it wasn't for me. And under their work, like, housing prices skyrocketed. So many of my friends, close family, and folks I know who just have moved away from the city and can't afford to live here anymore. And I knew that I had to weigh in, I had to jump in and do something about it.
So you co-founded City Hive, an organization that encourages civic engagement. Could you describe what City Hive does and how this and other experiences you may have had prepares you to represent your community as MLA?
Absolutely. So I co-founded City Hive, which is a mission to transform the way that young people are engaged in the planning, design, and decision-making in their cities and their communities. And our goal is really to build bridges between cities and civic institutions that want to engage young people on some of the largest challenges, whether it be local or global, from housing affordability to engaging young people in the municipal civic elections to fighting climate change and tackling environmental issues. And this work has really pushed me to build unlikely coalitions between different stakeholders. And so we were building bridges, especially on housing affordability. So looking at how young people in the city could be working with Van City, who is a big housing developer, with the City of Vancouver to inform policy, with Landlord BC, with the Real Estate Foundation of BC, as well as countless other organizations and associations that really had been working in the space already. And what we were doing was convening young people to be part of the solution, because so many of these issues, these policies, decisions disproportionately impact us as young people, and yet we're not there at the table, and we're often not invited to have an opinion, to have a say in the decisions that will matter so much to us now, but also to us in the future and to future generations as well.
So I just want to quickly follow up on that. You're talking about building these unlikely coalitions between young people who are suffering from affordability and these seemingly more powerful institutions like Landlord BC and real estate associations. Could you just give an example of, how, what is some common interest that these two groups seemingly opposite would potentially have in your view?
Absolutely. So one concrete example is one of the first partners that joined us was the Downtown Vancouver Business Improvement Association, right? And just from the sound of their title, you might wonder, why would they care about housing affordability? Why would they care about young people and support our initiative and our project? But really, they support businesses in the downtown core, and they know that it's young people that are the ones that shop there, that eat there, but also work. And businesses weren't able to retain their workers if there's a huge affordability crisis, because the gap between what people are paid and what it costs to live in the city was growing, right? And so they saw the need to weigh in and to play a big role as a community actor and as a community convener to make sure that young people could be at the table and talk to the city of Vancouver and talk to BC Housing to make sure that our voice was heard as it informed city planning as well as provincial planning.
I have a question. When you say like City Hive and the young people having a conversation with the potentially like the real estate developers, what have you guys been pushing for? What have you guys been pushing for?
Yeah, and maybe to clarify, I mentioned the Real Estate Foundation of BC. They're an agency that funds a lot of land projects, so they're not a development agency.
Okay.
Yeah, but like landlord BC, right? They represent landlords, right? So like, what kind of things are you pushing for with like what I think what ICE is getting to is like what are you like asking for?
Absolutely. So one of the projects that came out of the 30 network on housing affordability, which was the project that we ran with City Hive, was a collaboration and really looking at how landlords and renters could work together. And so one of the ideas that were proposed by this project was the idea of basically a way to rate landlords and also to rate renters as well, because I think as a former renter myself and having dealt with a whole bunch of different housing situations that are not necessarily favorable, it's sometimes nice to know who has lived in a certain landlord's place beforehand, and also whether they have an ability to what their past has been with previous landlords as well, because obviously renters are constantly asked to have references and to prove how they're trustworthy as a renter. But for landlords, often it's difficult to know until you've lived in that situation for quite a while. And so that was something that was building and nesting into some work that Landlord BC was also trying to do, because they represent landlords, but they also wanted to make sure that there was ethical folks that were being landlords were also being ethical about it.
Awesome.
Okay, so next question. Say it's October 25th and you get elected. What is your number one priority for your community in terms of dealing with like the multiple crises that we are in right now?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's exactly the point that you're saying, is that there are multiple crises, right? So we need to look at the climate crisis, the housing affordability crisis, as well as the global health pandemic, all concurrently, and looking for solutions that are win-win-win in that area. So right now, of course, as we're still in a COVID pandemic era, we need to look at how we're going to manage and prioritize human safety, the safety of people and health of people first, but also looking at, as we're thinking about recovery and as we decide to kickstart the economy again, how we will prioritize climate solutions, clean growth, green jobs, and also looking at ways to curb housing affordability as well, and continuing to put those measures in place. I know that the government has already done a really good job of this, but there's still much more work to be done, and on that front.
Yeah, so speaking of health, there are two fronts that I kind of want to discuss here. So first of all, since the schools are reopening and more than 30 schools in BC have reported COVID-19 outbreaks, so that's definitely been a source of anxiety for parents and teachers alike. What do you think the province needs to do to address these concerns?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I think the province, needs to and has been, but needs to continue working with teachers and with the BCTF specifically, the BC Teachers Federations, but also other important stakeholders, including parents, to make sure that, as well as Dr. Bonnie Henry and the health officials, to make sure that we are taking care of children and children's safety, and also the safety of teachers and staff in those schools and administrators are also prioritized as well. So really continuing to have that multi-way conversation to make sure that things that are working are being spread across the province, and things that aren't, there's quick information and response to make sure that those pieces are changing as well.
Yeah, the other aspect I wanted to address was the opioid crisis, and it is definitely accelerated during this pandemic with 909 overdose deaths as of the 2nd of September, according to BBC. So what strategies should the province be looking at to address this?
That's a great question, and this is really a crisis that spans across different jurisdictions. So there's responsibility from the provincial and the municipal as well as the federal level. And Premier Horgan has really made that plea to the provincial level, to the federal level, to really look at it, to have support, and also to really be able to expand the scope of the work that's being done already, because we know that the crisis that's happening, the opioid crisis, or some also known as the poison drug supply, is a problem that is chronic, and we need to make sure that we're figuring upstream solutions to be able to support that.
Just to follow up on that, what kind of supports do you think the federal government needs to provide in terms of dealing with opioid crisis?
Well, specifically, Premier Horgan, Dr. John Horgan has requested for the decriminalization of drugs, because I think it's really not about stigmatizing drug users, and more so to make sure that we have a safe supply, and that the supply of drug is not poison.
So in the longer term, once the pandemic ends, we are going to be left in an economy, and many BC people have lost their jobs and small businesses have closed for good. So federal aid that was keeping people and businesses afloat will probably begin to taper off. What would your priority be as a MLA in terms of dealing with the longer term impacts of this pandemic?
That's a really great question, and I think that really ties to your question earlier about what is your number one priority, and it's really to look at how we can stimulate jobs that will protect the environment, and also offer opportunities, especially for young people, for youth who have been disproportionately impacted, who have been often the first to be laid off. So many of my friends, who work in the service industry and the tourism industry, have been, supported by the provincial and the federal financial aid, CERB, among others, that are helping them through this hard time. But as you mentioned, they are looking for opportunities to give back. They're looking for jobs right now, and we really need to be able to stimulate and to provide new jobs and funding for green jobs in BC that can bring us to meet our climate goals, but also will provide great opportunities for young people to be able to apply their education and also their passion to make BC a green place.
So switching now to housing, a recent survey by the BC Nonprofit Housing Association suggests that more than 1 in 5 BC renters spend more than half of their income in rent. In the 2017 BC NDP platform, there was the proposal for a $400 annual renters rebate. This has not yet been implemented. Do you think the BC NDP should pursue this going forward? And what other approaches should the provincial government pursue to deal with the lack of affordable housing?
Well, as soon as the BC NDP government was elected in 2017, I went to the 2018 budget, so the first budget that they proposed, and they had a 30-point plan to address housing affordability in it. And because we know that there's no one silver bullet to solve the housing affordability plan, right? The housing affordability crisis. And within that plan, there were measures to address empty homes. There were measures to address foreign buyers and the speculation tax as well. And we know that this has been working because, I think there's been some debate and some confusion about whether housing prices have been going up or down. But if if you look at the facts and if you look at the numbers, so over the past 3 years under the BC NDP, housing prices have increased by a total of 3.9%, whereas under the Liberals in 2017, housing prices had risen by 55.1% in 3 years. So over the same time frame, there was an increase of 55.1 versus 3.9% right now, which is incredibly significant. And I think that just really comes to show that the BC Liberals knew that the housing crisis was being exacerbated, but they didn't have they weren't putting measures in place that were effective, and they were letting that go out of control.
Yeah. So in terms of slowing down the rate of growth, of course that's important, but in terms of where people are now, they're still in a situation where their incomes are not proportionate to the rent or the cost of housing, right? So we're still, in the housing crisis. So would you agree?
Absolutely. And I would say that when you look at affordability, it's not just housing, but it's housing and transportation mixed added together. And I think it's the CHMC, that the Canadian Housing Mortgage Corporation, that really benchmarks housing being affordable as being only 30% of your income. So absolutely, we're nowhere. Well, I think for most of us, we're nowhere close to that.
Yeah. All right. So I have a clip from your opponent, Michael Lee, from the BC Liberal leadership contest 2 years ago on affordability, and want to get your reaction to that. So let me just play this clip.
Young people are feeling that they're working harder and harder, but they're still not getting anywhere. We need to do something about that. And that's why we are here. Affordability is more than just about housing. We also need to create better paying jobs. The world needs both our natural resources and our natural talents as innovators. So
what is your response to that? And in terms of what should be the focus? Should the focus be on higher paying jobs or decreasing the cost of housing?
Mm-hmm. I think that's might be a bit of a false dichotomy, because I think, yes, we need to make sure that we're increasing the minimum wage and that people are being paid well, but that doesn't also mean that we can ignore measures that are needed to curb skyrocketing housing prices. And so I find it quite frustrating and rich coming from him and from the BC Liberals when they had 16 years to deal with this, 16 years to put something into place, to put measures, and instead they let the real estate market go out of control. And so it's just very frustrating to hear that, because for me, that's misleading. It's promising that they will take action when they had 16 years to do something about it. And during those 16 years, little to nothing was done that was effective. When the BC NDP came into power, David Eby looked into money laundering that was happening through our casinos and also through our housing market. And he found that in a single year, in 2017, over $1 billion was being laundered through the housing market. And not only was that the case, but also that the previous government knew that that was the case and had buried that in the report that was given to them by their bureaucrats. So when you talk about misinformation, and when you talk about government having that information and not doing anything about it, but also not releasing to that to the public, those are the type of things that make people like me, citizens like me, lose trust in their elected officials. But also, it also contributes incredibly to the gap between the cost of housing and what people can afford to pay for their housing based on what they're making. And of course, it's inflated when $1 billion is being laundered through the housing market in a single year. Can you imagine what happened over 16 years?
Indeed. So
it's something that I'm very emotional about, because I've grown up in the city and I don't know if I'll be able to stay in the city. And so many of my friends have left the city, and so many folks have to make difficult decisions about whether they can have children, whether delaying marriage, huge life decisions. And it's just so irresponsible, the misinformation that's being spread.
Yeah, but I'm just wondering in terms of, in particular, the incumbent you're running against, Michael Lee. He was first elected to the Legislative Assembly in 2017, so he didn't really take part in a lot of the stuff that you're describing. Um, and so, is it really fair to characterize, his positions as those of the previous Liberal government prior to his election?
Yeah, he decided to join that party after they had done those things for 16 years. So I think it's really about the choices that he made, right? That's the party that he said, yes, their policies, their work has been inspiring me, and that's why I want to join that team, right? So I think if he disagreed with what the previous Liberal government was doing over those 16 years, why would he have decided to join the BC Liberals and to run with them and to represent and carry their banner?
Fair enough. So moving on to pipeline politics, LNG projects pursued by this government are projected to account for 10 megatons of carbon emissions annually. That is more than all emissions from cars and trucks in the Metro Vancouver region, and 1/6 of our total carbon emissions right now. Do you think LNG is the correct direction for our province?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is a huge motivating reason for me to be running. I am running because, and as you probably know, my background is in climate advocacy. It's engaging young people in getting involved with taking action on climate change. And for the previous 2 years, I was serving and advising Minister Heyman on the BC Climate Solutions and Clean Growth Advisory Council. And so there was representatives there from industry, from labor, from Indigenous communities, from municipalities. And we looked at how could we create climate solutions, but also at the same time build good jobs and create good jobs for British Columbians. And, I can tell you at times we didn't all agree, as you can imagine, with such a diverse group of folks around the table. But the result of that and the result of the work from the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change was a Clean BC plan that was released in 2017. And I can tell you hands down, it is the most ambitious climate plan of any province across the country, hands down. And I know at the same time that it's still not good enough, right? That was phase 1 of Clean BC, which brings us 75% to our 2030 goals, but it still means that we have 25% remaining to get to our 2030 targets. And absolutely, there's more work to be done. But before that, there was no credible climate plan that would actually bring us to what we know we need to do in order to tackle the climate crisis. And so, beyond focusing on a specific project or a specific energy source, I think we need to be thinking about the big picture and looking at all aspects, whether it comes from transportation, whether it comes from the building sector, whether it comes from industry as well. I think we have to look at this as a comprehensive plan.
So, but even in speaking in terms of the big picture, in terms of the record of the NDP government, my understanding is that our emissions have only increased annually each year under this current government. And so, as a voter, what assurances do I have that these and it's projected that LNG is going to only expand, which is now becoming a significant contributor to our carbon emissions. So what assurances or reasons do I have to believe that the next 5 years would be different?
Mm-hmm. That's a really great question, and I appreciate your concern about it. And I would say, similar to the housing crisis, the stats that I mentioned where, housing prices have risen by close to 4% over the past 3 years under the BC NDP, but under the BC Liberals, it has risen by 55.1%, right? And so we know that climate actions that we're putting in place right now won't immediately have an impact in bending the curve, right? There's momentum with this where policies that are being placed to incentivize, for example, the purchase of electric bicycles, electric vehicles. We have committed to the phase out of the sales of new internal combustion engines, so like vehicles that run on fossil fuels by 2040, which is something that's really, really ambitious, but we won't see the impact or the results of these policies until a few years, right? Like we won't see these things change overnight, right? And so that's why I'm running right now, because I want to push our government and to have, the strongest climate policies possible, but I can't do that as an advocate outside of government.
Yeah, you also touched on, meeting with different stakeholders, and in terms of the recent protests, which actually, rocked this entire country, not just the province, prior to the COVID crisis, over the lack of consultation with the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs. What does Indigenous sovereignty mean to you, and especially in terms of the development of natural resources?
Mm-hmm. I think it means that Indigenous people who have been displaced, who have been dispossessed of their lands, and the resources that are associated with them have a real say in what is done, and have agency in choosing what happens on their land and what doesn't happen on their land. Yeah, and this is also part of why I wanted to run with the BC NDP, was because in the fall of last year, the BC NDP and the BC government was the first jurisdiction in all of Canada, all of North America, to adopt UNDRIP, which is the United Nations the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. And they were the first one to enshrine that into BC law and to commit to make sure that BC laws were in line with UNDRIP. And of course, I know that that's not good enough, that is just a first step, but nowhere else in the country has this been done. And we need to make sure that the government that put this in place stays there, so that we can continue to advance and to make sure that this is fulfilled. Because of course, putting it into law is the first step, but we need culture change, we need institutional change, we need community change, and also societal leadership outside of government as well to adopt this. And so it's really a larger shift than just government, but government absolutely needs to lead this, and we need to continue to do this good work. But it won't happen under a BC Liberal government. We know that much. They had 16 years to do it. They didn't do it.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. Just to clarify, in terms of the UNDRIP, it was, my understanding is that lays out a process that should have been followed in the case of the Wet'suwet'en pipeline dispute, but it was not followed. Do you believe that in the future that it should be we should be following the processes outlined in UNDRIP when dealing with these issues around natural resources and Indigenous sovereignty?
Absolutely, and I'm really glad that you're asking the question, because it's an issue that's so important to me, and it's part of why. So I know that you mentioned that I went to SFU, but I actually went to UBC just for a semester, because UBC offers a semester up in Haida Gwaii on natural resource management, natural resource sciences. And the reason why I went was because I had heard and read so much about co-governance and what that looked like up in Haida Gwaii. And that's what I was really curious about, looking at how the Council of Haida Nation and the provincial government and the federal government have been working together, co-managing Gwaii-Haanas down the southern part of the archipelago up in Haida Gwaii. And it's a deep, not just a deep interest of mine, but it's a responsibility that I think we all have as Canadians, as settlers here, to make sure that we repair the relationship that we have with Indigenous people, that we right the wrongs that have been done and have been done in the past, but also continue to be done. And so I really do appreciate the question, and absolutely that is a driving motivator for why I'm running, because I think we need more people in government who share these values and who are willing to be allies within government.
Yeah, so it seems like we have reached the end of our interview. Is there any issue that you think is important that we might have missed?
Yeah, I would like to add, because just the point, like an additional point about why I'm running. Over 1 in 4 British Columbians are under the age of 35, and yet there's less than a handful of MLAs in Victoria that are under the age of 40. I would be the only MLA, if elected, in the legislature under the age of 30. And of course, I don't mean to be able to represent all the views of folks that are young in BC, but I think if I run, if I win, I hope to be able to inspire other young people to consider that they also can do this, that they also don't have to wait until they're in their 40s or 50s or 60s or older in order to run and to be in governance of our province, because we need profoundly young people there at the table. And that was part of the work that I was doing at City Hive before I decided to jump into politics, was to make sure that not just young folks were at the table, but that there were Black, Indigenous, people of color, that there were queer, two-spirited, LGBTQIA plus folks at the table, to make sure that those who have always been disproportionately impacted by the policies that are being made have a voice. A driving motto of my work is nothing about us without us. And I would really hope and really encourage folks to consider, whether it's to run themselves or to get involved or to volunteer or to donate. We don't have the time. I don't have the time to wait for 10 or 20 years in order to run. The climate crisis can't wait. The housing affordability crisis can't wait. We can't wait to act. And I think our voices are needed there. And really, you know, regardless of whether you agree with my politics or not, I think to consider and to consider the privilege that we have to live in a democratic institution. You know, my parents, they came to this country as immigrants and refugees, and they've never let me forget that. They've never let me forget the rights and the privileges that I have being a Canadian growing up in this country, that so many other people around the world don't have the opportunity, don't necessarily have the same opportunities and the same rights to participate in a democracy and to elect who gets to be our leaders. So that's really my final advice and invitation for folks to join in and to get involved. And yeah, I just would really love to thank you both for taking the time to interview me and to ask some really good, really sharp questions as well, because I think it's needed.
Yeah, thank you for being here. And that brings us to the end of today's live stream.
Yeah, to close, you can find us on CITR News on Instagram and Twitter, so check us out there.